hello and welcome to everyone to today's webinar. Today we're doing a deep dive of the Water Resources and Ecosystem Services chapter of the National Issues Report. Today's event is the third of 4 webinars that make up our winter webinar series. So a warm welcome back to those of you who are joining us again, as well as to everyone new today. My name is Fiona Warren and I will be the moderator today. I'm the Knowledge Assessment Manager at Natural Resources Canada within the Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Division, where we lead Canada's national assessment process. Claire Sanders at the Climate Risk Institute will be available during the webinar if you run into any audio or technical issues. To ask her a question, open the chat box and use the drop-down arrow to locate Claire Sanders, and you can send her a private message that way. Please note that everyone's microphones have been muted to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. There will be 2 dedicated Q&A sessions today, but that doesn't mean you have to hold your questions until then. We encourage you to type out your questions during the presentations in the Q&A box. Les présentations seront en anglais, mais vous pouvez poser des questions d'anglais ou français. Aussi, les présentations sont disponibles dans les 2 langues sur notre site du web. We are recording the webinar today. We'll be sending out a link to everyone who's registered, along with a copy of the presentation slides. As a virtual event, we are gathered today across the traditional and unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples. On behalf of those of us in the National Capital Region, I acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. I invite you to use the chat box to enter your own land acknowledgement from wherever you are today, if you wish. On to today's webinar. We're going to be focusing on 2 chapters of the National Issues Report, which was released in June, and it focuses on climate change impacts and adaptation issues that are of national importance or that are best understood through an integrated pan-Canadian perspective. The report clearly demonstrates that climate change is already affecting so many aspects of our lives, that the impacts will persist and in most cases intensify, and that more action on adaptation is urgently needed. Like all of our reports, it's available at our website, changingclimate.ca. Today's webinar will begin with a presentation on the Water Resources chapter, followed by a short Q&A period. The Water Resources chapter examines climate change impacts on Canada's water resources and adaptation actions in the management of supply and demand, physical hazards, and water quality. The second half of the webinar will focus on the Ecosystem Services chapter, which examines the important role that ecosystems play in adaptation and the services that we derive from, and how the services that we derive from them are threatened by climate change. So now I'm pleased to welcome the first of our today's first speakers, Haley Carson and Alain Petronero. Haley co-led the development of the Water Resources chapter while working for Global Water Futures, a research program focusing on pan-Canadian water issues. She currently works as a policy analyst for Prairies Economics Development Canada and as a sessional lecturer at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Alain Petronero also joins us today. He is an internationally recognized expert in hydrology and sustainable water systems who has spent almost 3 decades studying water resources engineering. He's a full professor of civil engineering at the University of Calgary, where his research focuses on improving, developing, and evaluating hydrologic models, understanding the sensitivity of water resources to climate variability and change, and developing the next generation of hydrological modeling systems. So on behalf of everyone joining us today, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Haley and Alain for presenting on their chapter. It is much appreciated. So now I will turn it over to you, Haley and Alain. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona. I will pass it off to Al to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. I think you can hear me, but I can't seem to turn on my camera, so hopefully that can come on, but I'll get started. So yeah, just as a bit of an introduction, I'd like to acknowledge our co-authors, Wendy Leger, who was with Environment and Climate Change Canada, Stephanie Merrill, who now works in New Brunswick, but she was with Global Water Futures at the time, and then Patricia Gober, who was now a retired professor at the University of Saskatchewan. So when we first gathered together to do this, and we were asked by, I'll start my video now, thanks, asked by Fiona and Dawn at the time with NRCan to pull this together, We interpret the objectives as was really how we're doing an adaptation relative to what we know are the best practices. So it was really supposed to be an assessment and not prescriptive. The team reviewed hundreds of pieces of gray and peer-reviewed literature, tried to emphasize pieces published after 2014. A couple of caveats. We were limited to 15,000 words, so we tried to handle overarching issues. And we did some work with a few close-ups and some case studies. We could argue, I guess, this is a pretty fast-moving field, and so some of our stuff might be a little bit dated. But we tried to add as much new content as possible. So I'm assuming we're on slide 2 here now. So can you go to the next slide, please? Sorry. Okay, so the first key message that we came up with was really focused on what we know about how climate change has already affected Canadian water systems and how they may be impacted in the future. So what we looked at was we really looked at anticipated changes from anthropogenic climate warming and how it will directly affect the timing and amount of future fresh water supplies. This is work that is particularly concerns impacts in regions that are currently rely on snow and ice melt as freshwater sources. So, but also we looked at continental interior areas where increased evapotranspiration from warming temperatures would reduce future water supplies as well. We know that observed average temperature increases for Canada are about twice the global average and more than 3 times the global average in northern Canada. And so, you know, a lot of the work we did here was really focused on looking at the work that Barry Bonsall and his team did in terms of the water resources assessment and climate impacts. And so, you know, we got to the point in the study where we realized that the issues around climate change were really focused on you know, what I just mentioned, and basically Canada being a coal-dominated region, we noted that you know, there's a couple of points that were probably more pertinent than others. One is the changing in the timing of water availability. So we noted that the total volume of water flowing through a river through rivers in Canada, we saw significant changes in timing had been observed. This is Barry's work. And we also noted that increases in precipitation and transition from snow to rain was an issue that was pretty important with respect to the hydrological cycle. So of note, precipitation has increased across all regions by an average of about 20% since 1948. And you know, the phase change is important as well. So precipitation is falling more often as rain rather than snow. So next slide, please. So in terms of trends, we noted there have been actually no consistent trends in annual stream flow amounts across Canada as a whole. In the future, so if you look at the projections, annual flows are projected to increase in most northern basins, but decrease in southern interior and continental regions. So, you know, just to point out here that the hydrological cycle is quite complex. And so we're still not seeing a lot of trends actually based on historical records that are consistent, but we do project that these trends, there will be trends down in the future. And so we noted that in the study. Next slide, please. So we focused a little bit, given sort of what we've seen, I guess, historically, at least over the last, let's say, 15 years on flooding. So in terms of flooding, there are detectable changes in the nature of flood events in some areas, with what we noted were more rain on snow events, rainfall-driven events, and earlier spring flooding. So I think it's pretty clear a warmer atmosphere has been shown to make extreme precipitation more likely, and that contributed to the 2013 Calgary flood, the 2014 Assiniboine, and 2017 Ottawa floods. So the probability of occurrence is probably increasing there. You know, we should point out, I guess, we saw unprecedented flooding this November in BC, right, which obviously happened after this study was in place, but it just kind of confirms that what we're seeing is the warmer atmosphere is really contributing to extremes. So in the future, we're expecting to see more of these rain-generated flooding events from extreme precipitation, especially in urban areas. And I think perhaps what we saw in BC is helping to confirm some of that. Next slide, please. So if we look at droughts in the future, we also expect to see less water availability in southern basins, particularly in the summer. And so what we think is going to happen is summer rainfall in southern Canada is projected to decrease in a high greenhouse gas emission scenario. And we anticipate that we'll see more extremes in terms of summer dry periods, particularly across the southern prairies and interior of British Columbia. What we've noted over the last, let's say, 10 years is what we're starting to describe as flash drought scenarios, where perhaps the snowpack in the mountains is looking normal, but then all of a sudden, we have 6 weeks without rain, sort of in the mid-June to July period, right, which causes a bit of an issue with respect to water supply in places like the Milk River and the eastern flowing tributaries of the Rocky Mountains. And so we expect this to continue in the future, and we'll have to see how we adapt to that type of change, but we certainly are noting that it is becoming more frequent. Next slide, please. So this next slide shows a number of major recent water-related events and trends in Canada. And when we say recent, we mean before the publication of the chapter. So the current reality for water practitioners in every part of Canada is that the design and operational protocols required for water resources management, because they're based on historical understanding of the resource, don't necessarily apply as much anymore. So that's a real dilemma for engineers and planners and folks working, on long-term sort of capital projects, is how do we design things to deal with climate change? I think it's fair to say, and I think most people understand that, early indications that we're seeing now are that the future will no longer resemble the past. And these types of events will likely become more frequent and intense if we do not adapt. And so I think the writing's on the wall for everybody, and I'm sure everybody in this audience knows that strategies for adaptation need to be developed. So we can go to the next slide, please. So the next section, we had a key message, speaks to the way we are coordinating, or perhaps not, to reach our adaptation goals. As everybody understands, the primary jurisdiction over water lies with the provinces, but in reality, there are a lot of groups involved in governance and management of water resources. So over the past few decades, we've seen more involvement by different groups like municipalities, Indigenous communities, and environmental organizations. And we're actually seeing a declining role of the federal government. So in general, we're seeing a bit of a fragmented approach. As an example of these dynamics, we provided a box with a bit of a background on the current context for flood management in Canada. We understand that flooding is one of the most costly natural disasters in Canada. And, the federal government was involved in coordinating during the flood damage reduction program between 1976 and 1999. The program designated 320 flood risk areas covering more than 900 urban communities. But since it's been discontinued, it's been a bit of a fragmented approach to flood risk reduction across the country. Some municipalities still working with no or very dated flood maps, and many are poor quality or out of date. We do recognize that the federal government is now working on the National Flood Mitigation Framework, and is starting to develop some guidance, but there's still no real firm guidance on how climate change may interact and change our approach, I guess, with floodplain mapping. I've recently reviewed the National Flood Mapping Guidelines, and there will be a climate change chapter in there, but it's still probably not as prescriptive as we'd like it to be. And so, I'm working with colleagues in Environment Climate Change Canada to try to make that better. But it is a tricky subject, and it's not obvious how we get there with respect to some of the science, research, and development that needs to be done. So on that, I'll pass it back to Haley.
Thanks, Al. If you could advance a slide, please. So much of the literature and interviews we did with practitioners and the literature we looked at made it clear that high levels of adaptive capacity really did depend on access to adequate technical, human, social, and financial capital. So one of the groups we do touch upon in the chapter is municipalities. And as you can see on the graph on this slide, they've been slowly accumulating larger amounts of public infrastructure over time, while the federal share of that public infrastructure has been declining. But at the same time, of course, municipalities often lack the capacity to raise the revenue necessary to maintain and upgrade that infrastructure that they're slowly accumulating a greater share of. And this is despite the fact that they're now responsible for about 60% of public infrastructure across Canada. Next slide, please. This image is from the 2019 Canadian Infrastructure Report Card, and it just offers a bit of a snapshot around the status of a municipal water infrastructure across Canada. So as you can see, most of that infrastructure is rated as good or better, but there still is a significant chunk that is rated as being fair or in worse condition, and this is expected to increase over time. The 2016 report card does go into a bit more depth about climate change and talks about reveals that about half of municipalities have undertaken a risk assessment of their water-related assets, but fewer than 20% reported having introduced formal adaptation strategies to mitigate some of those risks. So we are seeing quite a bit of vulnerability in terms of municipalities across Canada. Next slide, please. So some of the strategies groups were using to coordinate more effectively or work with each other more effectively around climate change adaptation included partnerships. And this was something that was mentioned in basically all of the interviews we did. These were both formal partnerships and informal partnerships. And this was really a strategy that people were engaging in to facilitate information sharing, trust building, and cooperation across the different groups involved, and adding to the technical and human resources needed to actually adapt to these risks. Risk sharing tools were another strategy, and this allowed the different partners involved and different players involved to share in the costs of both mitigating and recovering from events. We also saw evidence of larger institutions and governments playing a supporting role for more local adaptation efforts. So for example, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, or ICLEI, has been credited as a key driver of mitigation and adaptation at the municipal level across Canada. Another strategy was incorporating diverse sources of knowledge, such as traditional knowledge, and this can really be helpful in terms of revealing previously unaccounted for variables and providing additional meaning around additional information around the meaning of change. And one of the most progressive examples of this in Canada in terms of water policy and the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, although the strategy is about 10 years old now, is the Northern Voices, Northern Waters Stewardship Strategy in the Northwest Territories. So this strategy was collaboratively developed with Indigenous communities and territorial governments, and the documents include explicit provisions for recognizing Indigenous rights and considering Indigenous knowledge as equivalent to more Western science-oriented approaches. Next slide, please. So as a case study into coordination, we looked at both transboundary water organizations and watershed organizations. And these groups often do a lot of the coordination work between the different players involved in the management of water systems and addressing water risks. One of the cases we looked at was the International Joint Commission, and some of their notable accomplishments, which with respect to climate change adaptation, include multiple large transboundary integrated assessments, which have resulted in flexible management plans and operating rules to address some climate variability and uncertainty that Al was speaking about before. The Great Lakes Water Quality Protocol, introduced in 2012, is one of the only transboundary coordinating instruments in the world to explicitly address the impacts of climate change on water quality. And then the IJC also released in 2018 a climate change framework to provide a bit of guidance for their various transboundary boards in addressing climate change in their policy and operations. Next slide, please, and I'll pass it back to Al.
Thanks, Haley. So in the next section, we looked at innovative approaches to adaptation in the Canadian water sector. One primary strategy we explore is adaptive management. So adaptive management provides a structured, iterative process of robust decision-making in the face of uncertainty, with an aim to reduce uncertainty over time via systematic monitoring. So in general, there are variable applications of this approach across Canada. And again, as Haley mentioned, the IJC is a bit of a leader here. They've introduced an adaptive management strategy for regulation plans on Lake Superior and Lake Ontario. Those are two areas where they actually have controls over water levels, as a means to review and refine the chosen regulation plans over time if conditions in the system change. Adaptive management compares observed outcomes through ongoing monitoring to the simulated results to improve the simulations over time. The ongoing performance of the regulation plans can be assessed under a range of water level conditions and regulation plans, and can be formulated and evaluated as more is learned. So really, it's a concept that I think a lot of people are familiar with. You adapt as things change, and you make sure that the proper monitoring is in place, the proper models are in place, and you react as quickly as possible to make changes to the operating plans. Next slide, please. Another strategy groups are pursuing is engaging stakeholders in scenario exercises, which involves simulating and exploring potential futures with the goal, among others, to develop adaptation options for what are going to perform reasonably well, no matter how the future unfolds. And the premise here is really to kind of turn the climate change approach a bit on its head by actually asking stakeholders, rights holders, others, what's important to them with respect to a certain outcome. So in the case of the Great Lakes, it was looking at water levels. And so when you talk to municipalities, it could be that the municipal intakes, need to be a certain depth of water above them. It could be different for the boating community, First Nations, others. And so the idea there was to really look at where the pinch points were with respect to, let's say, something like lake levels or water quality, and then to look at the climate models and to see how those pinch points could actually come to fruition, I guess, with time. And so really the idea there is to focus on engagement, to look at some of the issues with respect to what's important to stakeholders and rights holders, and then look at the climate change scenarios and look at, from adaptive management perspective, what might impact folks with respect to some of their important indicators. So we'll go to the next slide, please, and then Haley, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Al. So in the next section, we looked at public opinions and attitudes, which was identified as a key element to making progress on adaptation. And generally, water, as I'm sure is clear to everyone on this webinar, is perceived to be very abundant across Canada, usually of high quality by the majority of Canadians, but tends to rank lower compared to other issues on the policy agenda, as it were. So on the graph on this slide, this is from the RBC Canadian Water Attitudes Survey, which was done in 2017. You can see that climate change and water issues rank under the cost of living, availability of healthcare, and economic problems. Generally, we also observed a low level of reported preparedness among the general population for extreme events. In one of the surveys we looked at, only 35% of those surveyed reported that they were prepared. They felt prepared to deal with flood events or drought events. And then we also noted a bit of a disconnect between practitioner perspectives and public perspectives around some of these issues. So for example, in one survey we looked at, practitioners were reported believing that aging infrastructure was the most prominent future risk in the Canadian water sector. But in another survey, only 1 in 5 Canadians believe that major infrastructure investments were required. So a bit of a different perspective and gap in perspectives there between practitioner and public. Next slide, please. The good news is, though, that surveys were showing a strong overall support for action on water-related impacts of climate change, and people were really wanting the government to play a strong role in that action. And some of the policies that appealed to people in the water attitudes study, for example, were regulatory approaches and increasing water pricing for industrial and commercial water users. The graph on this particular slide is from another study done out of the University of Waterloo, where respondents were asked who should play a role in terms of protecting against flood risk and paying for flood damage. And as you can see, In particular, people were playing a big role for governments in terms of seeing a big role for governments in terms of protecting against flood risk. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the strategies people in different groups were looking at and pursuing to build public support for adaptation, a big one was making sure that quote unquote water issues were discussed and framed in a way that was considered to be relevant and usable by Canadians. So one strategy, a very popular one, was emphasizing some of the co-benefits around water-related adaptation actions, such as emphasizing cost savings or health benefits. Another strategy was making sure information was available for people when they were actually at a particular decision point, such as when they were about to purchase a home. Another strategy was identifying the behaviors that were actually preventing people from engaging in whatever desired activity that would contribute to adaptation options. And this could be something like time or financial constraints. We looked at an example in the city of Barrie, Ontario, where financial constraints were identified as a major reason people were not able to install water efficient appliances. Another one that practitioners really emphasized when we spoke to them in our interviews was making strategic use of opportunity windows that were periods that could contribute to heightened public and political attention around a particular water-related risk or issue, and thereby providing some momentum around maybe introducing new adaptation guidance. And these might occur, of course, after a large event, such as what we observed in BC in the fall. Next slide, please. So in the final section, we looked at the ability of our information systems to inform resilient design and our adaptive capacity in terms of infrastructure design and maintenance. So as I'm sure is not a surprise to everyone on this particular webinar, high quality, systematic, regularized data collection is not necessarily always the norm across parts of Canada. And there tends to be a range of information available across different organizations, but the capacity to provide this information and access this information does tend to be uneven across organizations. The image on this slide is from a synthesis of 25 vulnerability assessments across Canada to pull out trends. With respect to information systems, the authors noted that it can be very computationally expensive to get the right climate change information to support decision-making around water. So that might be information that doesn't exist at the right spatial scale or temporal scale for decision-making. They also noted that local expertise, such as a local expert that has particular insight around a local weather phenomenon, is very valuable in terms of a source of information to support decision-making. And they also note that some jurisdictions are still using very dated methods. So they provided an example of the city of Welland that was using IDF curves that were created in 1963, and that being a very dated approach. Next slide, please. In terms of infrastructure, in general, the case studies were pointing to some best practices around resilient water infrastructure design and operation, including good maintenance and management. So older and or more poorly maintained or managed infrastructure being more at risk to climate change impacts. Building redundancies into water systems. So this may be a strategy such as creating multiple intake points or delivery mechanisms. For new infrastructure, it was advised to consider climate change impacts during the project design phase, and also ensuring that any infrastructure related codes or standards or related instruments were reflecting reliable and up-to-date information and or factoring climate change projections into them. A number of studies, though, also pointed at a number of vulnerabilities, including design and operating rules that are really based on historical empirical records rather than anticipated future conditions. And this is something that Al talked about at the beginning as well. Another noted vulnerability was the tendency to not account for low probability events with highly adverse impacts, and as a consequence, perhaps underinvesting in emergency planning and preparedness. And then the high costs around building, maintaining, or upgrading infrastructure to new design or regulatory standards, which can be a barrier to action in terms of building resilient infrastructure. We also noted increasing interest in nature-based or natural infrastructure solutions to water-related challenges, which will be discussed in a bit more detail in the ecosystems section of this webinar, so I won't touch on it too much in our presentation, but just to note that there was some demonstrated in the literature, at least, increasing interest in nature-based or natural infrastructure solutions to water-related risks. Next slide, please. So in terms of knowledge and information exchange gaps that were challenging effective adaptation in the Canadian water sector, we highlighted a few in the chapter. One was fragmented information to support decision-making. I talked about a little bit about that lack of capacity there. Gaps in bridging the knowledge between the researcher community and the practitioner community, and some gaps around translating that scientific and technical knowledge into practical guidance for decision makers and practitioners. We also noted the development of practical strategies, a gap around the development of practical strategies and support to build consensus or compromise between different stakeholders that oftentimes can have competing objectives around water. In terms of research gaps, we noted some important gaps in terms of monitoring and observational data, particularly for certain regions of Canada and particular variables. A need for model intercomparison and ensemble modeling approaches to support practitioners in terms of working through those future scenarios of change. A deeper understanding of the institutional barriers to change. There wasn't a lot, it was sort of piecemeal handled in the literature around what the institutional barriers to change might be, and what the indicators of institutional resilience to climate change impacts in the water sector were. And then finally, the need for the systematic evaluation of successes and failures at the various scales that adaptation is occurring. So in general, our overall impression from reviewing this material and the case studies is that there were really promising pockets of innovation and adaptation occurring in the Canadian water sector and at different scales. And we are seeing some demonstration of the best practices that Al mentioned at the beginning. However, there remains largely a lack of institutionalized, systematic, and national level approaches to some of these issues, which can leave us vulnerable to adverse impacts in the long term. And I think we're actually done our portion of the presentation a little early, so I'm not sure who's handling questions.
Thanks very much, Haley. That would be me who's handling the questions, and we did have a few come in, but first of all, a big thank you to you and Al for the presentation. So we had a couple come in during the presentation, but I encourage people to continue to enter them now. The best way is to click on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So the first question we have is about groundwater, and are there ongoing federal government initiatives to improve the assessment of the impacts of climate change on groundwater?
Al, this might be a question for you.
Yeah, I figured you'd punt it. So as far as I know, there actually isn't anything national in scope with respect to groundwater. I know NRCan, from a federal perspective, has the lead for groundwater. I suspect the issue from a climate change perspective is actually recharge. That's probably the biggest issue to look at with respect to changing precipitation patterns. But I also suspect that there's a fair bit of discussion around use as well, right? So as surface water supplies maybe disappear in some areas, or summers get drier, do we use more groundwater? But as far as I'm aware, and maybe I'm incorrect here, but there's been no national systematic view of climate change impacts, and then the subsequent sort of downstream effects on groundwater, either use or recharge. So I'm not aware of anything.
Great, thanks, Al. And was there a section in the chapter focused on groundwater that we could refer people to?
Not really. We focused on surface water, but maybe Fiona, that's something that actually should be looked at, right? And there's a couple of really strong people at NRCan that could look at that. So
yeah, for sure. Thanks. Okay, so we have another question, and it's about water treatment. So where climate change impacts the potable water resources for expensive treatment plants, what are the best ways to solve these issues without spending a lot of money? I don't know if that would be better directed towards Haley or Al, but
I can take that one if you want, Al. You can back me up. or disagree with me, I guess. So the chapter wasn't really meant as providing a series of recommendations per se. We were trying to do more of an assessment of where we're at nationally. But I can note that water quality improvements were also an often reported co-benefit of some of the natural infrastructure or nature-based solutions that we looked at, such as via the restoration or retention of wetlands. We talked a bit about an example in Manitoba, Pelly's Lake, which is a restored and engineered wetland. It provides flood reduction benefits, but also water quality co-benefits. And so natural infrastructure can be a more flexible and cost-effective solution relative to built infrastructure, such as building a water treatment plant. That can also provide some important co-benefits, such as carbon sequestration or improved water quality or ecosystem health. And I would say that that was an approach noted that was sort of emerging and becoming more popular and relative to some of the historical treatment of this issue.
Great, thanks, Haley. Anything to add to that, Hal?
No, just to emphasize, I think the whole idea of nature-based approaches is gaining a lot of traction, right? Even municipal, you look at municipal stormwater management as an example, right? So a lot of the technology now is focused on sort of more natural approaches, right? So people are getting their heads around it. They're starting to understand it more. And even in the engineering world, I'm seeing design principles being developed around some of these more natural-based solutions, right? So that's encouraging. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. It's something we can look forward to hearing more about too in the next presentation. So I'm just watching the questions come in here. Well, first I'll just share a comment that we got in the Q&A box in terms of the groundwater. I think it's from David McLeod, just noted that regulatory guidance on access to groundwater for geothermal heating and cooling will become an issue in urban areas. So there's no question there specifically, but I don't know if either of you want to comment on that. We can move on.
Yeah, I'm sure he's correct. It's not my area, so I won't comment.
Okay. Okay, there's a question on water quality. So regarding water quality, what do you think about control system at the source points, both known and unknown?
I'm not sure I follow the question. So I'm assuming this is point-based pollution. So
It must be, yeah.
Out of pipe work. I'm not sure that looking at from an adaptation perspective, there's much that can be done there, right? It's more of a regulatory, largely provincial issue, I guess, with some federal oversight on some of that. So I'm not sure there's a real climate change impact. The only thing I can think of from a climate adaptation perspective is, we typically look at dilution as a bit of a solution, right? And so I think, as the flows get less in some of these systems, if we have droughts, I think there's probably a downstream impact that we need to be aware of. That's about as far as I think I can take it from an adaptation perspective. Hope that helps.
I can mention and just follow up that I think generally in the chapter, we looked more at non-point source pollution. And one of the case studies, we looked at this Lake Simcoe watershed. Obviously, phosphorus runoff into the lake is a big issue there. So there was recognition amongst the Conservation Authority that climate change was contributing to larger runoff volumes, which was sort of exacerbating the problem around phosphorus runoff into the lake. And that had led to, eventually they led to a development of their current phosphorus offsetting policy that we do address in the chapter. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it does provide a bit of relevant content.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Haley and Al. We have a question now about, I guess, specific examples. Were there any specific examples that you found in your work that highlight, really good case stories, I guess, of what local governments are doing to deal with the risks related to water resources? I suppose both, probably with the focus on water quantity, but maybe also with water quality.
I think, Haley, that you're best placed to deal with that one, right? But we saw some really nice work being done, right? So there's some some excellent examples, I think, that we saw, and I'm sure there's some more that we haven't even included here, right? So I think what we're seeing is some of the municipalities, even with some of the First Nations, others are really kind of stepping up and doing things quite well in terms of adaptation. But Haley, if you want to refer to a few specific examples.
Well, we cover quite a few case examples in the chapter. They're not all at the municipality level. Actually, I'm not sure if any of them are now that I think about it, but the Lake Simcoe example, Conservation Authority is one. The IJC we focus on quite a bit as well. In terms of municipalities, we did look at Gibson's BC and their application of natural infrastructure approaches. Being one of the first municipalities in North America to declare natural infrastructure assets as municipal assets, and a study they had done on finding that their natural assets would contribute about 3.5 to 4 million annually in terms of the value that engineered assets would provide. And we mentioned a little bit about Toronto's Green Roof program as well, but those are the examples that sort of come to mind for me.
Great. Thanks, Haley. And I might also refer the person who asked the question to the changingclimate.ca website, where we also have the map of adaptation actions. And there's a number of case studies there from the broader literature as well. Literature. There's a bunch of case stories and case studies there that where you might find some of relevance. Thanks. The next question is about the regional diversity, I guess. It states much of the work in terms of the adaptation focus is in the southern parts of Canada. What about hydrological monitoring and modeling in northern Canada? Al?
Yeah, I can take that one as the former director of the National Hydrological Service, and I think Elvis, one of our postdoc students in GWF. So yeah, that's a good question, Elvis. I think a couple of things. One, it's very expensive to monitor in the north. It's about double the cost of monitoring in the south, right? So that's always been a bit of an issue. But hopefully with the adaptation of the new Canada Water Agency, we can spend a bit more time focusing. If we're going to develop adaptation strategies in the north, in my view, and I could probably say this now that I'm no longer the head of the Water Survey of Canada, we probably could use a bit more monitoring in the north, probably strategically designed to actually deal with some of the adaptation issues that we're seeing up there. We are noting discontinuous permafrost. There's some big issues there. There's also community monitoring, and that's a big issue right now, I think, and it's actually working quite well, and the technology is changing too. So, you can do things now with cell phones, believe it or not, where you can look at velocities of rivers and actually do some estimates of flow. There's some new satellite technology that's coming as well, right? So I think a combination of community-based monitoring, working with Indigenous communities as well, some of the new satellite technology and some of the new sort of in situ technology, all these things can sort of come together to help, maybe build a bit better infrastructure in the north. And then certainly if we can put an adaptation lens around that, that should help us down the road in the future as things change. So I'm pretty optimistic that the technology and the people on the ground will actually help move this forward. So hope that answers your question.
Great, thanks, Al. And this question is a little bit related. It's also on the north, and it's with respect to permafrost thaw. So how much data and understanding is there on permafrost thawing on water quantity and quality, for example, mercury pollution for both surface and groundwater? I don't know if that was touched upon in your chapter either, though, but I'll throw it out there for you guys.
Yeah, not really very much, but I mean, I can't offer much in terms of mercury, but I can certainly say that we've seen some encouraging work coming out of around the Fort Simpson area. There's a researcher at university, and this isn't in the chapter, but there's a researcher at the Wilfrid Laurier University, Bill Quinton, who's done a lot of work with community monitoring for discontinuous permafrost in and around Fort Simpson, Scotty Creek, that area. So I'd encourage you to look. There's actually a good YouTube video on it as well. and have a look at that and see, right? So again, I think the communities are now understanding that climate change is real. They need to adapt to it, right? And so it's really a kind of a First Nations and community-based approach to dealing with discontinuous permafrost. So in my mind, that's a really good example of how people can get together and try to understand the issue and try to get ready for it. So yeah, just Google Scotty Creek permafrost and you'll find it.
Great. Thanks very much. I think that brings us to the end of our 10-minute Q&A period. We got too many of the questions, but not quite all. If we have time for the remaining ones, we could do them in the second Q&A, or we can follow up afterwards with people. So a big thank you, Haley and Al, for your presentation today. And to everyone for their excellent questions as well. Now I'd like to welcome our next 4 speakers, who are all authors of the Ecosystem Services chapter. First, I'd like to introduce Michelle Molnar, who is the coordinating lead author of the chapter. Michelle has over 15 years of experience in ecological economics and interdisciplinary research, focusing on conservation of natural capital using valuation, policy analysis, and public outreach. Next, we will hear from Matthew Mitchell, who is a research associate at the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at the University of British Columbia. His research focuses on how to manage human-dominated landscapes, including agricultural and urban landscapes for both people and nature. Next up, I'm also pleased to welcome Mark Anielski, who is the founder, president, and CWO of Anielski Management, Inc., an economic strategic consultancy that helps nations, cities, and corporations develop a well-being-based approach to strategic planning, governance, and budgeting. And then our final speaker today will be Paige Olmsted. Paige is a senior research associate at the Smart Prosperity Institute, an Ottawa-based environment and economic policy think tank. At SBI, Paige leads the Nature team with a research focus on policy and enabling conditions that increase public and private investment in ecosystem services and the natural environment. So thank you very much, Michelle, Matthew, Mark, and Paige for being with us today. And without further ado, I will turn things over to Michelle. Michelle.
Thank you, Fiona. I should probably also note that one of the other co-authors wasn't able to join us today, Kiera Rodsat-Hearn, but the team is certainly aware of her valuable contributions to our chapter. So the Ecosystem Services chapter explores the risks and impacts that climate change poses for Canada's ecosystems and the services they provide, as well as opportunities for adapting to climate change. Now, what I probably don't need to say to folks on this webinar is that Canada has some of the world's largest forests, tundra, prairie, wetland, and freshwater ecosystems in the world. And when I refer to ecosystems, they're really a dynamic system composed of living organisms, think of plants, animals, and microorganisms, and their environment, which interact in a range of ways as one functional unit. They're critically important components of Earth's biological diversity and as the natural capital that sustains human life and well-being. Now, biodiversity and ecosystems produce a rich assortment of benefits that people depend upon and value, and they're often referred to as ecosystem services. So the diagram here speaks at a very high level to how ecosystems are generated through an ecosystem's organization and structure, and then through ecological processes and functions, ultimately leading to ecosystem services and benefits to humans. So this chapter really makes the case that the preservation of ecosystem services in the face of climate change and the application of nature-based approaches to climate change adaptation is a strategy that can help achieve multiple goals. Next slide, please. So ecosystem services refer to the varied benefits we receive from nature. Ecosystems provide us with life support, such as food, fresh water, and clean air to breathe. They support our economies by providing raw materials and protecting us from hazards and extreme weather events. They inspire us, they provide a sense of place, and are an essential component of our culture. So the image on the right-hand side of this screen shows a subset of services of relevance to adaptation. Now, this is the first chapter within Canada's national knowledge assessment process to examine ecosystem services and nature-based approaches to adaptation. So as such, it's intended to provide an initial input into the rich and evolving dialogue around this topic. Future assessments will build from this chapter and endeavor to capture and reflect the learning and new knowledge that's being generated through projects and research that's currently underway in this area. Next slide, please. So climate change affects biodiversity and ecosystem services in a multitude of ways. So it's critical to kind of keep at the back of your mind as we're going through this presentation that complexity. So the drivers of change, including climate change to ecosystems, do not act in a linear manner. Ecosystems can respond to climate change through one, feedback loops that can limit, reduce, or further magnify impacts on ecosystems and people. Second is thresholds, where a relatively small change or disturbance, think of a small change in temperature, can cause a rapid change in an ecosystem and its resulting services. And then thirdly, tipping points, where a particular threshold, if crossed, can result in ecosystem shifts to a new state, significantly changing biodiversity and ecosystem services. So with that, I just want to note that I'm joined here today by several of the co-authors of this chapter to present 4 key messages, which highlight the current state of knowledge on issues of priority. And I'll turn it over to Matt to walk us through the first 2 messages. Matthew?
Great, thanks, Michelle. So I'll be talking about 2 of the key messages from our chapter. The first one is that climate change is threatening Canada's ecosystems and the services they provide. And what I want to highlight here is that we've phrased this as is threatening, not will threaten. We have extreme weather events that are increasing. I'm here in Vancouver. We've had an unprecedented heat dome this year, the floods. A tornado went, a kilometer away from where I live this summer. There's similar events like the droughts in the prairies that are happening. We have shifts in seasonal climate patterns, so an increase of about 1.5 degrees nationally, but in certain places even greater than that, 3 times in the Arctic, especially warming winters compared to summers. And then we know that these sorts of events, these changes in weather events and climate are interacting with other pressures that affect our ecosystems, things like habitat loss, land cover change, pollution, overharvesting invasive species, biodiversity loss. And so all of these pressures, especially climate change, are altering the ecosystems, the natural capital that we depend on that provide the ecosystem services that we benefit from. And so if we think about any ecosystem in Canada, it relies a lot on the climate that's there. If we think about the rainforest on the BC coast or alpine Arctic tundra, grasslands, they all have a unique climate that they're adapted to. And as that climate change is altered, those ecosystems as well will be altered. And that will affect the benefits that we receive from them. At the same time, ecosystem services aren't just about the ecosystems themselves, the natural capital. It's also about human demand for them and what we require, what we would like to see from our ecosystems, and that will change as well with climate change. Right now in BC, we have seen a want for increased flood regulation, and there's the natural solutions that are coming out are around that. As well with climate change, we're also going to want to have more kind of heat mitigation or heat island mitigation in cities as well. And so both that supply of services and the demand by people is changing with climate change. Next slide, please. So what are some of the changes in those ecosystems that we expect and that we're already seeing in Canada? So one of the big ones is a change in phenology. Phenology is the cyclic and seasonal patterns of natural phenomena. So here we're talking about things like when do plants produce their leaves? When do those leaves fall? When do the plants flower? When are animals migrating? When are their breeding seasons? We know that climate change triggers changes in things like migration, breeding, hibernation. We know that there's changes in the emergence of Columbian ground squirrels because of climate change that have been observed. Changes in the flight patterns of butterflies in Canada as well. And when there's these changes in the phenology of species, that can mean mismatches between what those species are doing, what's happening with ecosystems, where the resources are that those species need as well. So if you think about birds migrating, if all of a sudden those birds are migrating at a different time and their food source isn't available, they've missed it or they're too early, that sort of thing, all of a sudden that's going to have a large impact on those species. Some of the key examples of these changes in phenology are disruptions of plant pollinator or plant pest interactions. So pollinators emerge, especially native pollinators like bumblebees come out at certain times of the year based on temperature. If they are mismatched with when their resources, when the flowers are coming out as well, then you may have loss of those species, or you may have plant species that aren't getting adequately pollinated. And that can have big effects for ecosystems. It could also have impacts on things like blueberry production or other agricultural production that rely on native pollinators. And in some cases, we can try to account for this with adding honeybees. But in a lot of cases, those native pollinators are much better at pollinating certain species like blueberries or apples. One other example that I can think of around phenology is the mountain pine beetle, and how climate change allowed that beetle species to actually have increased numbers of life cycles in the summer, and actually increase their population levels really rapidly, with impacts on forest health, timber supply, and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. The other thing that we see with climate change is significant shifts in the distribution of species as well. And so this isn't limited to just mobile species. We also are seeing shifts in tree species. So, we've observed a northward shift in species like red maple, sugar maple, paper birch in the forest in Canada. And as these shifts and changes in forest ecosystems happen, it will have impacts on timber supply, changes to carbon storage, especially below ground as well, when you have broadleaf species that cycle nutrients through these ecosystems a lot faster, changes in carbon storage, and impacts also to wild food supply. We've seen shifts in freshwater fish. It's documented that sunfish are moving northward at around 13 to 15 kilometers per decade. As we see those changes in fish species, there will be changes in those aquatic ecosystems, and also potentially changes in recreational fisheries and fishing opportunities in some of those freshwater areas. We've had range shifts of forest and agricultural pests and disease vectors. One of the best ones that I know of is changes in the distributions of deer ticks, which impacts humans through the prevalence of Lyme disease in Canada. And that's becoming an increasing concern, especially in certain places in Canada as ticks move northward. And then a really interesting example is what's been coined as the shrubification of the Arctic. So an increase in shrub growth due to increases in temperatures and longer growing seasons. This can lead to a really dramatic shift in the vegetation in Arctic tundra ecosystems, with one impact being the loss of important tundra berry species. So things like cloudberry or bog cranberry all of a sudden are shaded out by all of these increased shrubs, with a loss of wild food provision. Next slide, please. So our key message number 2 is that impact will vary across Canada's ecosystems and regions. When we're talking about ecosystem services, we are talking about a large diversity of benefits and the same kind of diversity in how communities and people interact with ecosystems to gain those benefits. So climate change is impacting ecosystems in different ways in different places. We saw some of those examples just looking at water resources. Some places have more water, some places might have less with climate change. We're also having, those ecosystems from those changes, their responses are varied depending on their exposure to climate change impacts, their sensitivity, what Michelle mentioned earlier, those thresholds and tipping points. But how people also interact with ecosystems varies widely across Canada. We're a really large country. We span all the way from the Arctic down to the border with the US. So we interact with the ecosystem differently, and we also have different vulnerabilities. So often we highlight Indigenous communities, communities reliant on natural resources, communities in certain locations like Arctic or coastal areas are going to probably see really varied or increased impacts of climate change on their ecosystem services. So this figure here just highlights some of those differences, from reduced glacier cover and loss of water resources in the west, to reduced ice cover and loss of permafrost in the north, to potentially, increased sea level rise or lower Great Lakes water levels in the east as well. So understanding this variation is going to be an increasing challenge to understand what are those impacts that are happening and how do we adapt to them. And I'm just going to highlight a few specific regions with some of those changes and what we think might happen to ecosystem services. So next slide, please. So we know that northern regions, Arctic regions in Canada are hotspots of climate change effects. The Arctic is warming at 3 times the global average. We also often have more vulnerable populations in these areas, communities that rely closely on natural ecosystems for their food, their water, as part of their identity and cultural practices. This figure shows some of those changes from climate and how it will flow through key impacts, environmental impacts, and then socioeconomic impacts. And a lot of these are ecosystem service-based changes. So where we have shifts in vegetation, changes to the water cycle, loss of permafrost and sea ice, it will lead to environmental impacts like changes in freshwater chemistry, changes in the populations of species that were traditionally used for hunting, more intense floods, changes in the landscape, more frequent forest fires. And that will all lead to changes in things like tourism, but also food security, health, cultural values, displacement of communities. And I think the Arctic is a place that's really of a focus because, one, it's warming at a much greater rate than the rest of Canada, but also some of these changes are going to be much more dramatic. When we think about, we're not just thinking about a change in tree species in a forest, we're talking about replacements of ecosystems that have been there for millennia, like the tundra, to things like forests. So really dramatic shifts in northern regions, and that will have really large impacts on those ecosystem services. Next slide, please. Mountain regions are also a place that are expected to see really large changes. So one of the issues here is for species in mountain regions is as the climate warms and they want to stay within their temperature range, they run out of real estate. They either run into the tops of mountains and they can't move any further, or they're going into places where there's no soil, it's bare rock, and so they can't migrate or shift their distributions any further. So we have alpine plants are especially vulnerable to these effects of climate change, but also any mobile, animal or insect species that are alpine species. We see lots of changes in losses of glaciers. I think everyone's probably aware of that loss of glaciers and loss of snow cover. That's going to mean increasing risk of rock falls and mudslides. There was in 2020 a giant landslide in Elliott Creek in Butte Inlet in BC, and unleashed like a 100-meter tsunami. And scientists believe part of this is that there's been a loss of glacier and snow cover, ice cover, and that's meaning increased risk of these types of events. We have changes to mountain forests. So this drying of mountain regions, lower snowpacks will lead to less water for the forest and the trees, will lead to less or thinner forests. And that could impact, have decreased flood control and impacts to water runoff and quality. And then there'll also be really complex impacts to recreation. If we think about the Rockies and places like Banff and Jasper, really important places for tourism, the recreation could actually increase in the short term in the next 20, 30 years because of warmer weather increased suitability for tourism. But after that, with this loss of glaciers, changes in ecosystems, that tourism might actually decrease as the region becomes less suitable for those sorts of activities. Next slide, please. In forested regions, a lot of what we talk about is increased risk of wildfires and droughts, and we've already seen those increases in wildfires across Canada in forests. And so as those wildfires increase, they have increased impacts on forests. We also have the potential for what's called megafires, so extremely large hot fires that could shift forests from coniferous species to broadleaf forests, or even to non-forested ecosystems if they return within a short amount of time. All of this will have impacts on things like the carbon storage of our forests, timber supply in various areas, and also how we're able to recreate in a lot of the northern forests around Canada. There'll also be increased impacts on forest pests, on forest ecosystem services. One good example is spruce budworm, which is becoming an increasingly important pest in northern forests. The predictions are that the range of those spruce budworm will move northward, but it will not move very much at the southern limit. So we'll have an increased area that's defoliated by spruce budworm, with, again, potential changes on the ecosystems themselves and what species are in the forest, but also a lot of these other ecosystem services. Next slide, please. And then the final region I just want to highlight is coastal regions. So Canada has the world's longest coastline. Similar to alpine ecosystems, those coastal ecosystems can be squeezed out, in this case, not because of directly because of rising temperatures, but because of sea level rise. So we'll have often loss of these important coastal ecosystems. There's also going to be the impact of changes to ocean water properties. So ocean temperatures are rising, but also changes in the chemical property of the ocean. So salinity, increased acidification, potential for hypoxia or low oxygen levels. All of these could also impact the distributions of fish in the ocean where we see fish, especially important commercial fish species. And especially things like ocean acidification are predicted to impact shellfish as well. So shifts in these species or loss of these species from certain regions could have large impacts on fisheries and also, traditional food gathering. I'll just highlight again as the coastal Arctic regions, being both Arctic and coastal, face some of the most dramatic and interacting changes. And this figure here demonstrates some of those changes, both from changes in sea ice, but also shifts in fish species, loss of the sea ice for ringed seals or polar bears to pup or to forage. And so really dramatic shifts in these regions as well. Next slide, please. And so how can we address these really varied and diverse changes? They're going to be widespread. They're going to be significant in many cases. A lot of this is going to rely on diversifying sources of livelihood and economic support. So ensuring that communities are not completely reliant on a single source of livelihood or a single ecosystem service. Are there ways that we can diversify their livelihoods? This will require really increased educational, logistical, and financial resources to manage key ecosystems. And I will highlight that we actually need a lot better information on where those key ecosystems are for certain ecosystem services and for certain communities. And I'm happy that the federal government has started a sensitive environment that I hope will do some of this work. We also really need to assess the vulnerability of communities to ecosystem service change. Not every community or segment of the population is going to be affected the same by changes in ecosystem services. And understanding those and addressing that is going to be a key action as well. And then the final one that links onto what Mark's going to talk about right after me is learning from Indigenous knowledge and how do we respectfully engage with Indigenous communities to learn from them about how to interact and manage our environment while not perpetuating historical harms by appropriating this knowledge. So with that, I will hand it over to Mark.
Thanks, Matt. Mark had to run to another meeting, so I'm going to do my best to jump in and do some justice to this third key message, which is that Indigenous knowledge is vital to maintaining ecosystems. So Indigenous First Peoples of Turtle Island or North America, since time immemorial, have been living in harmonious relationships with the land, navigating the waters, and stewarding the ecosystems they have occupied for thousands of years. Their resilience and capacity to flourish in a variety of ecosystems as abundant as west coastal ecosystems and as harsh as cold Arctic landscapes speaks to their capacity to adapt and even flourish through the numerous climatic events that have shaped North America even before the Great Ice Age of 10,000 years ago. The key to the resilience of First Peoples is their deep relationship with the land, waters, plants, and animals, and their capacity to live natural laws. By natural law, I mean a system of law based on close observation of human nature and on values intrinsic to human nature that can be deduced and applied independent of positive laws. So it is through the maintaining of traditional knowledge, through ceremony, that First Peoples affirm their touchstone of wisdom, namely all my relations, which is the focal point of all considerations in the management of the shared natural assets of their traditional lands. So humans are seen as being in harmony and harmonious interrelationships with all other living creatures. Wisdom, stewardship, and the capacity to live and flourish on the land comes from observing animals and plants in the dynamic dance of homeostasis through seasons and along long epochs of ongoing climate change. So Indigenous people really epitomize adaptation in the face of constant flux in the ecological conditions found across a variety of landscapes and ecosystems. So the Indigenous section of this chapter really highlights some key lessons and adaptation practices of many First Nations. They include that Indigenous peoples across Canada have developed an in-depth knowledge of place accumulated over long time frames, as well as a framework for understanding complexity. Indigenous knowledge has been described as a process that explores how constituent parts of a system interrelate and how the systems they are part of change over time and relate to larger systems. And really, it's this cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and values which are acquired through experience and observations on the land or from spiritual teachings and are handed down from generation to generation. An Indigenous way of knowing and adapting to the environmental changes includes an understanding of the interrelationships that occur among species, among their connections within the biophysical environment, the spatial distributions and historical trends of spatial and population patterns. And this form of knowledge evolves over long time periods and involves constant learning by doing, experimentation, and knowledge building. So there's a need to recognize that Indigenous knowledge systems differ from non-Indigenous knowledge systems and that they form an equal part in policy development, in programs, and in decision-making, which can yield richer and more balanced outcomes for maintaining ecosystems and their services, upon which many Indigenous communities rely. Co-management arrangements that are designed to involve Indigenous peoples from the initial strategic stages of planning allow for improved holistic decision-making and Indigenous empowerment over the activities taking place on their land. Indigenous ownership and control of their Indigenous knowledge must be respected, recognizing the fundamental rights of Indigenous knowledge holders involves and includes sharing the monetary benefits obtained. So Indigenous peoples across Canada are playing an important role in demonstrating leadership on climate action, stewardship, and the maintenance of ecosystem services. With that, and just looking at the time, I'll turn it over to Paige to review our final key message.
Thanks very much, Michelle. So our fourth key message of this chapter is that nature-based approaches to adaptation maximizes benefits. And so what we're illustrating here with this image from the chapter is that these nature-based approaches, which we're using as an umbrella term to reflect what we might call nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure, natural asset management, ecosystem protection and restoration, improve our ability to have adaptive capacity and provide flexibility when we're engaging in various adaptation strategies. And even though we may be particularly focused on a particular issue, they provide a host of co-benefits, which Michelle illustrated at the beginning, and I'm going to illustrate on the next slide with a specific example. If we could go to the next slide, please. And so urban forests are something that I think folks are familiar with, and just one example. And familiar for thinking about forests often in any context, recognize the idea that they can sequester carbon, improve air quality, they can improve water quality in urban context when we're thinking about supporting infiltration or reducing erosion, depending on where trees are planted. But ultimately, what also happens in cities is people get out more. They can improve community cohesiveness. And we saw this in the pandemic. There's a real emphasis and understanding that if you can get outside and exercise, of course, there's health benefits there from a physical standpoint, but also a mental standpoint. And many studies have demonstrated these benefits, including a recent study that showed major cities across Canada and their various parts, when folks had actual risk of dying from a cardiac or respiratory illness from 8 to 12%. In Brampton, there was a really interesting study that modeled different levels of tree canopy cover in relation to hospital admissions because of the influence on the urban heat island effect. I also wanted to mention, as we mentioned in the chapter, in Kingston, Ontario, they invested and really supported an urban forest plan with a specific idea of addressing the, urban heat island effect. And while that was certainly the primary focus, and they found benefits such as cost savings from energy conservation and regulation, they actually did a study that found that there were upwards of $2 million worth of benefits that were beyond those that they sought. And so it's just to illustrate that these co-benefits are present when we're thinking about nature-based solutions and these different nature-based approaches. Next slide, please. This is a table from the chapter, and as was hinted at in the previous chapter presentation, in this chapter, we do explore a little bit around this idea of natural infrastructure, and particularly in comparison to engineered infrastructure. In this table, you can see we've got services delivered on the left, but the engineered strategy tends to be on the right, and in the middle, the different types of natural assets that can support the delivery of that service. In the chapter, we talk about True Nova Scotia, where they've had 85% loss of their tidal wetlands, much of which was because they were converted for different types of engineered assets, such as dikes and berms, in order to protect against storm surges and sea level rise, but we're finding that they weren't adequate. So after several flood events, there was an advisory committee that actually found the most cost-effective approach to be a combination of this engineered strategy. So they shortened and reoriented the dikes, as well as engaging in wetland restoration. And so that allowed them to address flood mitigation strategies, but also increase fish nursery habitat, provide a storm buffer, and carbon sequestration benefits. And there was a question in the comment about sort of the risks and vulnerability of natural infrastructure, but I think it's worth noting that on their own or when combined with engineered infrastructure, they can reduce the wear and tear and increase longevity of engineered infrastructure, and also consider that natural assets are assets that actually increase in value over time rather than depreciate like constructed and engineered assets. So not suggesting that one should be replaced wholesale by the other, but considering these approaches give us more options. Next slide, please. This photo is an illustration of something that took place in BC. This Green Shores program is something that's put on by the Stewardship Center of British Columbia. And Green Shores is a rating and certification program that includes best practice standards for how to do some of these different types of coastal restorations. And what they found when they did this was not only did it reduce the impact of storm surges, erosion, and sea level rise, but for every $1 invested, there was $2.50 that were returned when calculating all of these different types of co-benefits that we've discussed. A study was done afterwards to consider how can we promote the implementation of these types of natural infrastructure projects, because they do seem to be a good idea and seem cost effective, but harder to scale their implementation. And so some of those recommendations were increased community incentives, targeted outreach to engineers and contractors who might be less familiar with some of these practices or are more used to the traditional procurement processes that they follow, and also strengthening links to tools and organizations that are operating in this space. We mentioned the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative and others in the chapter that are experts and support capacity building at the municipal level. Next slide, please. And so overall for nature-based approaches, while, as I just mentioned, we're finding lots of good reasons to think that they can be supportive of what's happening in different types of settings, the types of recommendations that were present for Green Shores are also, when we're thinking about how to scale these approaches, something that seem to be relatively common. One is that funding criteria often are not accounting for co-benefits. And so on a relative comparison, natural infrastructure might not look as appealing as other types of more traditional engineered infrastructure. There's also the consideration of training and capacity building. These are often involving multidisciplinary groups of folks that need to come together. There's often upfront costs because of the novelty associated with this, that even if those costs are paid for in the long run, providing support for those upfront costs is often something that's missing and can deter people from being involved. There was a question I saw related to formal accounting systems in the Public Sector Accounting Board. And that's something, and Michelle may want to speak to this because she's been involved in the process, but when we think about standards, this is something that will enable more nature-based approaches to be implemented when everyone's speaking the same language and using the same definitions. And what happens currently is if you can't put natural assets on your books, then it is harder to make the case for the types of accounting processes that need to justify expenditures. And so this is a strategy that many people are supporting and think can be helpful in enabling more nature-based approaches to take place. Excuse me. And the last one is just simply to provide some hope, perhaps, or feature that or highlight that these ideas are being thought about at the national level. And the forthcoming national adaptation strategy is going to include not only a nature pillar that has the kind of the traditional conservation considerations, but also the pillar related to infrastructure is called built and natural infrastructure. And so some of these ideas, and I think this was hinted at by the water chapter, are becoming more integrated. And so it's something, there's promise there in terms of getting more creative and thinking about how these ideas can apply. So I'll turn it back to Michelle for the concluding thoughts.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paige. So I'm going to do my best in 60 seconds to wrap us up so that we can at least accept a few questions. And to do that, I'm going to leave you with just a couple knowledge gaps and 3 emerging issues. So in terms of the knowledge gaps, the climate change impacts to ecosystems and their services. There's significant work research to be done here. I think we've aimed to give you a bit of a preview of the complexity of projecting changes resulting from climate change to ecosystems and their services. So certainly there is more research needed to better understand how changes to ecosystem services under a changing climate will affect communities. Secondly, data and support structures. Not a surprising knowledge gaps. Definitely there is a need for more open source data, for standards, for metrics, improved collection and sharing of baseline data. In terms of emerging issues, the first is valuation. So with increased incidences of extreme weather events across Canada, there's a renewed interest in valuing and utilizing nature-based approaches to meet needs. Secondly, improved integration of Indigenous knowledge. So as part of the national effort to commit deeply to the truth and reconciliation process, capacity building and empowering Indigenous leadership and autonomy are important elements. And then lastly, broadening collaboration. Extending beyond traditional partnerships and seeking new collaborations is needed. This is not an easy thing to do and certainly takes time and effort, but we have pointed to cases throughout the chapter where new partnerships have emerged. So with that, I think I'll stop and turn it back to Fiona so that hopefully we can accept a question or two.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. We'll just invite the speakers to turn their cameras back on. So we only have a few minutes. That's the bad news. The good news is, though, is that I'm looking at the questions that were asked, and I think many of the presenters answered them as they were going, but we'll just give other authors an opportunity to jump in on some of these questions. So the first one I know Paige provided a partial answer to and thought, Michelle, that you might have more to add, and that's on the Public Sector Accounting Board. And do you have any comment on whether we need the Public Sector Accounting Board to allow valuation of natural assets like water resources to be included in municipal financial statements?
Sure, thanks, Fiona. Absolutely, I think it's important at this time there is a prohibition against recognizing inherited assets, which would include all of your intact ecosystems. This is being done or looked at, I should say, from the International Public Sector Accounting Board, and their discussion group, which isn't a decision-making body, is certainly considering it. And I think they've heard the message that this isn't completely new and novel, and it's being done elsewhere. So I would say it's under consideration in Canada.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And then there's also a question about whether nature-based solutions can be more vulnerable than human-made infrastructure. And I know, again, Paige, you did touch on that in your presentation, but I wonder, Matt, if you wanted to jump in on that with respect to the different regions of Canada that you discussed.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question, and I think that maybe sometimes it feels like there's more control over infrastructure and stuff like that than an ecosystem, which can sometimes do its own thing. But I'm sure Paige and Michelle probably can speak better to me about this than I can. But my sense is that if these things are thought about carefully and designed properly and in combination with infrastructure, that they can actually be more resilient in a way, because they can actually adapt and change to a greater degree to climate change than, say, kind of, just harder infrastructure or traditional ways that we've dealt with these problems. Things like sea level rise and putting in, wetland or marsh ecosystems that it can actually move and change depending on the sea level rise, rather than just a hard seawall that seems to break every time we have a storm, kind of thing.
Okay, thank you. Paige or Michelle, do you have anything to add before we wrap up?
On that point, the only thing I'll add is that, as Matt pointed out, we do have a lot of vulnerable ecosystems out there. But when we're talking about natural infrastructure, usually that is a partially designed system or, an intended system to provide a specific service. And so the considerations about, when we would consider a natural environment as part of infrastructure versus not is a little bit different. And so if we're talking about a particularly vulnerable region where we know that the types of plants or things that you'd want to use were at specific risk as a result of climate change, it would probably influence your strategy. But in general, the idea that natural infrastructure can enhance the longevity of hard infrastructure and provide some of these adaptive measures is something that I think is broadly true in the way that we're thinking about implementing it.
Great. Thanks, Paige. I see we're at 1:30, so I'm going to wrap up for the day. So a big thank you again to all of the presenters. Thank you to the audience too for all your excellent questions. Our National Issues Report Winter Webinar Series will conclude next Friday with a webinar on the costs and benefits of climate change impacts and adaptation chapter. And we hope you can join us then. So wishing everyone the best for a great weekend, and hopefully we'll see you next Friday. Bye. Thank you.